The soldier hit the floor of the emergency room before the gurney even stopped rolling. Blood everywhere, soaking through the sheets, dripping onto the tile, pooling dark and fast under the fluorescent lights. Doctors shouted over each other. Security rushed the doors. And the man on the stretcher, massive, shaking, a gunshot wound tearing through his left side, snapped awake swinging, knocked a crash cart halfway across the room and screamed at everyone to get the hell back. Nobody could get near him. Then a young nurse nobody had ever paid attention to walked straight through the chaos, leaned down close, and said 4 words quietly into his ear. The sniper went completely still. "Captain, it's over. Stand down." His eyes found hers, his fist unclenched. And somewhere in that lockdown emergency room, the real story was just beginning. If this story already has you hooked, hit subscribe and stick with me until the very end. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The night shift at Blackstone Medical Center started the way it always did. Short-staffed, undersupplied, and already behind before the clock hit 11. Emily Carter clocked in at 10:52, changed into scrubs in the locker room with 2 minutes to spare, and walked onto the floor without stopping at the nurse's station mirror the way some of the younger staff did. She wasn't 23 anymore. She didn't need to check her hair. She needed to know which patients were deteriorating, which attending physicians were on rotation, and whether radiology had finally sent up the imaging for the patient in Bay 7 who'd been waiting since 6 that evening. They hadn't. She grabbed the chart anyway, made a note in the margin, and started her rounds. Blackstone wasn't a bad hospital. It wasn't a great one either. It sat on the edge of Redwood Falls like it had been forgotten there. A mid-sized regional medical center with enough trauma capability to handle car accidents and gunshot wounds and the occasional industrial incident from the mill on Route 9. But not enough staff or funding to handle much beyond that. The people who worked there were mostly good, mostly tired, and most of them had formed their social hierarchies years ago, the way people do in any closed system. Who mattered, who didn't, who you listened to, and who you quietly ignored. Emily had never broken into any of those circles. She'd transferred to Blackstone 14 months ago from a position in a smaller clinic 2 states away, offered no explanation for the move, made no effort to explain herself, and went about her work with a focused efficiency that some people read as cold and others just didn't read at all. She was 31. She had no photographs on her locker. She ate lunch alone when she ate lunch. She was good at her job. Genuinely good. The kind that showed in outcomes rather than performance. And almost nobody noticed. Dr. Marcus Hale noticed, but only in the negative sense. He was the senior attending physician on the trauma floor, well-liked by administration. The kind of doctor who used the word protocol as a weapon in arguments he was already winning. He'd corrected Emily twice in front of patients, dismissed 2 of her clinical observations in the past month without reading the supporting notes, and once described her to a colleague as competent but overreaching, which was the worst thing you could say about a nurse in a place like Blackstone without technically saying anything at all. Emily had heard him say it. She hadn't responded. She'd gone back to work. That was 14 months of her life at Blackstone, condensed down to its essential shape. She showed up. She worked. She went home to the apartment on Delancey Street with the broken blinds and the second-hand couch, made tea she sometimes forgot to drink, and slept 4 to 6 hours before doing it again. It wasn't a life that looked like much from the outside. She knew that. She also knew that the patient in Bay 4 had been under-medicated for post-surgical pain for the past 2 days, because the resident had transcribed the dosage wrong and nobody had caught it. She'd caught it. She knew that the woman in Bay 11 was showing early signs of compartment syndrome that the orthopedic consult had missed, and she'd already filed the note and flagged it twice with the charge nurse. She knew that the oxygen saturation readings on the monitor in Bay 3 were running about 2 points high because the sensor clip was worn and nobody had swapped the equipment in 6 weeks. She knew all of this because she paid attention, because she'd been trained a long time ago and in a very different context to notice exactly the kinds of things that got people killed when nobody noticed them. She didn't talk about that training. She hadn't talked about it to anyone in Redwood Falls. It was 11:47 when the ambulance bay doors blew open. She heard it before she saw it. The slam of the outer doors, the radio crackle, The particular pitched urgency in the paramedic's voice that meant something genuinely bad had come in. She stepped to the edge of the nurse's station and looked toward the trauma bay. The gurney came through fast, 2 paramedics running it. One had a pressure dressing clamped against a wound site with both hands, leaning his full body weight into it, and still wasn't stopping the bleed. The patient was enormous, 6'3" at least, broad across the shoulders, the kind of physical build that looked wrong lying down because it was built entirely for motion. He had military short hair and several days of beard, and a face that would have been handsome under other circumstances. Right now it was gray-white and locked into a jaw-clenched grimace that suggested either extreme pain or extreme training in managing it, probably both. GSW, left lateral thorax, possible pneumothorax, BP tanking, the lead paramedic called out. Lost him for about 40 seconds in the rig, got him back, he's been in and out. And then the patient woke up. It was violent and immediate. No gradual surfacing, no blinking confusion. He came up like a switch had been thrown, grabbed the paramedic's wrist with one hand and shoved with the other, and half rolled off the gurney before the security team at the door even had time to move. The crash cart beside Bay 1 went over sideways with a sound like a car accident. A nurse scrambled back. Someone shouted, "Sir, sir, you need to stay down. Get away from me." His voice was raw, hoarse, but steady. The kind of steady that wasn't calm. It was controlled. There was a difference. "Nobody touches me. Get back. Now." "He's going into shock," someone said. "We need to—" I said back. He'd positioned himself against the wall without seeming to think about it, left hand clamped over his own wound, scanning the room with the systematic eye movement of someone running a threat assessment, not looking for a way out, looking for a specific kind of danger. "Who called this in? Who made the call?" Dr. Hale pushed through from the back of the growing cluster of staff. "Sir, I am the attending physician, and you are going to bleed out on my floor if you don't let us—" "Who called this in?" The paramedics responded to a 911 call. "That's not what I asked." His eyes stopped moving. They had fixed on something, or rather, on the way the room was arranged, on the 2 staff members nearest the door, on something that was apparently wrong with a picture only he could see. "There are 4 people in this room who don't belong here." There were not. Emily had counted. Every person in Bay 1 was Blackstone staff or the paramedic team, but she didn't say that because she was watching his eyes, and she recognized the pattern in them. She recognized it because she'd seen it before, not in hospitals, in much worse places. She stepped forward. "Emily, stay back," the charge nurse started. She didn't stay back. She walked through the cluster of people, past Hale's outstretched arm, and stopped 2 feet from the man bleeding against the wall. He tracked her immediately, pull out, hands coming up, posture shifting, and she kept her own hands open and visible and still. "You're bleeding through your hand," she said. "Whatever you're looking for, you're not going to find it if you pass out. Back up. In a second." She held his gaze. Echo 7 Whiskey. The room didn't understand what happened next. She wasn't sure she fully understood it herself, standing there. But the effect was immediate and absolute. His hands dropped, his shoulders lost about 30% of their tension, and he looked at her with something that was almost more unsettling than the aggression had been. Recognition. And something behind it. Something that looked a lot like fear. "Where did you get that?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Same place you did." His legs were going. She could see it. The slow compromising of the muscles, gravity starting to win the argument. She stepped in and got her shoulder under his arm before he went down, and he let her, which was its own kind of answer. He was at least 220 pounds. She braced without visible effort. "I need a gurney, and I need type and cross now," she said over her shoulder, and her voice had changed. Not louder, not sharper, but with a quality of expectation that made people move. "Somebody get me the portable ultrasound, and I want a chest x-ray queue opened before we even get him onto the table." People moved. Hale hadn't moved. He was watching her with an expression she'd seen before on faces like his, not quite anger, not quite confusion. The particular look of someone who has just seen an established order violated and hasn't yet decided how to respond to it. She didn't have time for that right now. The man's name, she learned it from the paramedic paperwork 20 minutes later, was listed as James Rourke, age 38, no listed next of kin, no insurance card. The ID in his jacket pocket was military, and it was the kind of military ID that had a specific classification designation stamped in the upper right corner that most emergency room staff would not recognize. Emily recognized it. She worked on him with the controlled focus she always brought to trauma cases. Better controlled than usual, if she was honest, because she could feel the part of her brain that she'd spent 14 months trying to shut down coming back online like a generator after a power cut. Assessing, calculating, running parallel tracks of clinical analysis and something else, something older and more ingrained that didn't have a name she used in civilian hospitals. The wound was bad. Left lateral thorax, as the paramedics had said. Entrance wound consistent with a high-velocity rifle round, not a handgun. The trajectory was wrong for a front-facing exchange. She noted that and kept working. There was a secondary injury to his left arm, upper, that the paramedics had either missed or not flagged. Bruising pattern inconsistent with impact, consistent instead with a restraint of some kind. She noted that too. Hale was back now, having apparently decided that the patient being stabilized took priority over the breach in protocol. He leaned over the imaging results on the portable screen and pointed. Possible hemopneumothorax. We're looking at a chest tube. Agreed, Emily said, and handed him the right instrument before he asked for it, which made him pause slightly. You've done trauma work before. Some. Where? She didn't answer. Rourke was watching her from under half-closed lids, conscious now, stable enough to maintain awareness, but not fighting the treatment anymore. His eyes hadn't left her since she'd said those 4 words. She got through the next 40 minutes on the particular autopilot that good trauma work required. Present, technical, not quite thinking, just doing. Her hands knowing the next step before her mind had articulated it. By the time Rourke was stabilized, tubed, and moved to a monitored room on the trauma floor, it was nearly 2 in the morning. She should have handed off the chart. That would have been the normal thing. She followed him instead. The room they'd put him in was Bay 7 on the trauma floor, isolated, which was standard for security reasons when a patient arrived with a military ID of that classification, though most of the staff probably hadn't thought about it in those terms. She checked his monitors, adjusted the fluid line, looked at the drainage output from the chest tube. Adequate. Not great. He was watching her. You're going to tell me you're just a nurse, he said. His voice was clear now, still rough, but the shock had receded enough that his baseline was coming through. His baseline was careful and precise. That's what I am. That call sign is 22 months retired. It was never in any accessible database. He shifted, grimaced at the movement. I've been in this bed for 45 minutes and I've counted 3 exits, the camera blind spot in the upper left corner, and the fact that the orderly who came in 7 minutes ago was walking wrong. Walking wrong how? Like someone used to body armor. His eyes held hers. So you want to tell me what's going on, or you want to keep pretending you work here? I do work here. Okay. A long pause. Captain, I thought you were dead. The words landed somewhere she hadn't expected them to land. She kept her expression level. I'm not a captain anymore. I'm a nurse in Redwood Falls. Right. He didn't believe her and wasn't pretending to. You want to explain how a former Army combat medic attached to Task Force Ardent ends up working the night shift at a regional hospital in upstate New York? I left the service. People don't leave Task Force Ardent. They get rotated out, they get promoted, they get injured out, or they... He stopped. Something moved across his face. Or they run. She didn't respond to that. What happened to your team? He asked. The monitors beeped steadily. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang and was answered. Emily looked at the drainage output again, checked the number against the baseline she'd logged, and said nothing for long enough that it became its own kind of answer. My team is dead, she said finally. Most of them. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Pemberton? She looked at him. Staff Sergeant Dale Pemberton, he said. He was with Ardent before he transferred to my unit. 6 months ago, he gave me a name. Said if I ever got into a situation where I needed someone I could trust completely and couldn't go through official channels, he paused. He gave me your name. Said you'd be somewhere nobody would think to look. She absorbed that. Pemberton. She hadn't heard that name in 2 years. Something tightened in her chest that wasn't clinical. Why did you need someone you couldn't go through official channels with? His jaw worked. He looked at the ceiling, then back at her. Because I think official channels is how I ended up on your floor tonight. She'd already been thinking it. She hadn't wanted to be thinking it. She'd spent 14 months trying not to think things like this, trying to live inside the narrow, manageable world of shift schedules and patient charts and the broken blinds in her apartment. But the wound pattern had been wrong, and the restraint bruising had been wrong, and she knew what those things meant even when she wanted them to mean something else. The shot, she said. Where were you when it happened? Checkpoint 4 miles outside Dunmore. Classified extraction point. I was the only person in that location. He paused. Theoretically. Who knew the coordinates? 6 people. His voice was flat. Commanding officer. 2 members of my unit. The logistics coordinator. The mission handler. And 1 external contact who is running the operation from the DC side. And you trust all 6 of them. I trusted all 6 of them. Past tense, precise past tense. She looked at the wound again. High velocity, long range. Someone had been waiting at that checkpoint, or someone had told someone else who had been waiting. You said something in the trauma bay, she said. You said they weren't trying to kill you. You said they were trying to flush someone out. He met her eyes. The shot was placed, he said quietly. It was serious enough to put me in emergency transport, but not... It missed organs it shouldn't have missed, if you know what you're doing, which the person who made that shot absolutely does. He inhaled carefully, the chest tube making the breath deliberate. I was supposed to end up in a hospital, a specific hospital, I think, and I was supposed to be conscious enough to react the way I always react in unsecured spaces. Violently, she said, which creates a scene, which draws in everyone within range. His voice had gone very careful. Including, apparently, people who know a 22-month retired call sign. The silence in the room had a different quality now. You think someone used you, she said, to find me. He didn't say yes. He didn't need to. Emily looked at the monitors. She looked at the door. She thought about the orderly who had come in 7 minutes before Rourke mentioned him, and she thought about the way the man had hesitated at the threshold. A small thing, barely a second, in the way that people sometimes did when they were scanning a space before entering it rather than simply walking into a room. She'd noticed it. She'd filed it. She'd told herself she was being paranoid. She was possibly not being paranoid. How many people know you're here? She said. Anyone monitoring emergency dispatch for this county? A pause. Which, depending on what kind of resources are behind this, could be a very specific list of people. She checked the time. 2:14 a.m. The floor was quiet. Night shift had its rhythms, and she knew them, who was where, when rounds happened, which cameras had the coverage gaps that everybody knew about, and nobody had filed a maintenance report on because the budget request kept getting denied. I need to make a call, she said. To who? Someone who doesn't exist on paper. She was already moving toward the door, already running calculations she hadn't run in more than a year. Distances, timing, which routes through the building were covered and which weren't. Emily, she stopped. He almost never used first names, she'd bet. It was the kind of thing you could tell about a person. Whatever you're about to do, you need to know that it's already in motion. What is? I saw a vehicle in the ambulance bay when they brought me in. Black SUV, government plates, parked at an angle that's not a parking space. His voice was level. It was there when I arrived. It's been there this whole time. She stood in the doorway. And there's someone in the hallway, he said. Has been for the last 10 minutes, moving slow, stopping at intervals. Not a nurse. She didn't look at the hallway. Not yet. She thought instead about Pemberton, and about a night and a place she would never say the name of, and about 6 people who were supposed to be alive and weren't, and about the particular kind of silence that follows a betrayal when everyone involved is still pretending it didn't happen. She'd built 14 months of a careful, quiet life on the hope that the silence would hold. She turned back to Rourke. How bad is it? The real answer. He looked at her steadily. Someone burned me to find you. They used a sanctioned mission to do it. That means this isn't one person acting alone. It's a structure. It's people with access, with authority, with the ability to move resources without leaving obvious tracks. He paused. And if they went to this much trouble to locate you, Emily, it means you have something they want, or you know something they need buried. She knew exactly what she knew. She'd known it for 2 years and 3 months, and she'd kept it in the locked part of her mind the way you kept a thing you couldn't unsee and couldn't prove and couldn't afford to have anyone find out you were holding. Get some rest, she said. I'll be back in 20 minutes. And if you're not? She looked at him once, direct, the way she'd looked at men in much worse situations than this one. Then you'll know it's worse than we thought. She walked out into the hallway. The person Rourke had clocked was 50 feet down the corridor near the supply alcove, holding a clipboard in the way that people held clipboards when the clipboard was a prop. Shoulders wrong. Shoes wrong. Tactical rubber sole, not the soft-soled footwear that Blackstone required on clinical floors. Standing at an angle that allowed a sight line to Bay 7's door without appearing to look directly at it. Emily walked the other way, took the back stairwell to the ground floor, came out through the maintenance corridor that ran behind radiology, out through the side exit that the day shift used for smoke breaks, and stood in the cold October air with her back against the brick wall and her phone in her hand. She stared at the number she'd typed but not called. 14 months, a whole constructed life. The apartment on Delancey, the secondhand couch, the broken blinds, the tea she didn't drink. She'd been so careful. She'd been so deliberate about being nothing. And someone had found her anyway. She pressed call. It rang twice. A voice answered. Male, alert despite the hour, the kind of alert that meant he hadn't been sleeping. Yeah. It's Harlow, she said. The name she'd used before the name she used now. I need a secure channel. I need it in the next 30 minutes. And I need you to tell me who's been running a location search on former Ardent personnel in the last 6 months. A pause on the other end. A long one. Emily, I know. How bad? She looked up at the hospital building, at the lit windows of the trauma floor, at the black SUV still parked at its wrong angle in the ambulance bay. I need to go back inside, she said. There's a patient who can't be left alone. Emily, how bad? She thought about the wound that wasn't meant to kill, the call sign only 6 people should have known, the figure with the clipboard, and the tactical shoes pacing a slow circuit outside a patient room at 2 a.m. The vehicle pulled forward in the ambulance bay, stopped. 2 more figures got out. Get Pemberton if he's reachable, she said. Tell him she's live. He'll know what that means. She ended the call and went back inside. The elevator was slow. She took the stairs. By the time she pushed through the door onto the trauma floor, she could see immediately that something had changed. The quality of the air, the set of the few staff members visible, the way the charge nurse at the station was on the phone with the particular stillness that meant she was getting instructions from someone other than a doctor. And at the door to Bay 7, there were now 2 men who had not been there 20 minutes ago. Suits, badges on lanyards she couldn't read from this distance. One of them was talking to Marcus Hale, who was nodding with the eager, slightly too fast compliance of a man who'd just been shown credentials that scared him. The other one was looking directly at Emily. She didn't stop walking, didn't change her pace, didn't look away. She'd been running for 2 years. She was tired of running. Whatever had followed her to Redwood Falls, whatever was standing in the hallway of her hospital at 2 a.m. with government badges and tactical shoes, it was here now. It had always been coming. She'd known that in the part of herself she'd been trying not to listen to. She walked toward the men at the door, and her face was perfectly, deliberately calm, and her hands were open at her sides, and she made a decision somewhere in those last 20 feet of corridor that felt less like a choice and more like the end of a very long exhale. She was done hiding. She just needed to keep Rourke alive long enough for it to matter. The 2 men at Bay 7's door clocked her coming from 15 feet out, and the one who'd been watching her shifted his weight, just slightly, just enough, in a way that meant he was going to try to intercept her before she reached the room. She beat him to the threshold. "Excuse me." He stepped directly into her path, badge already raised. The lanyard said Federal Security Office, which was a designation she'd never heard of in 6 years of active service, and that alone told her something. "This room is restricted. Patient is under federal protective custody. He's under my care, she said. I'm his primary nurse. You'll need to hand off to another staff member. Floor access is being limited. On whose authority? She kept her voice flat. Not aggressive, just exact. The man glanced at his partner, which was the first small mistake. Colonel Darius Steck, Federal Security Office. He'll be on site within the hour. I asked whose current authority. Right now. The patient has a chest tube draining hemothorax, a fluid line that needs to be monitored every 15 minutes, and a recent extubation. If you pull his nurse and replace her with someone unfamiliar with the case at 2:30 in the morning and something goes wrong, that's a medical liability that falls on whoever authorized the change. She looked at the badge, then at his face. I'll need that spelled out in writing before I hand off. Another glance at the partner, longer this time. Behind them, Hale cleared his throat. Agent, I apologize, the nurse isn't aware of the full situation. Dr. Hale. She turned to him, and there was something in how she said it that made him stop. Not loud, not rude, just a quality of finality that she hadn't used with him before, the kind that came from a place he'd never seen in her, and it made him go quiet in a way that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. I am aware of the situation. I need to check my patient. She stepped around the agent and went into the room. Rourke had managed to shift upright another 3 inches. His color was better than it had been, though not good. He was watching the door with the particular expression of a man who has already run 3 versions of the next 5 minutes in his head and doesn't love any of them. The one on the left is carrying something beside the standard sidearm, he said before she could speak. Inside left jacket, too rigid for a second weapon, some kind of device. I know. She was already at the monitors, checking, noting, hands moving through the routine checks that were also a way of thinking. They're citing federal protective custody. Someone named Steck is supposedly incoming. Something changed in his face, subtle but real. Darius Steck. You know him. He was the external contact. His voice had dropped low enough that it didn't carry past the foot of the bed. He was one of the 6 people who knew my coordinates. She stopped moving. Let that sit for exactly 1 second, then kept working. He's coming here personally, she said, which means he knows I survived. And he knows... Rourke stopped, exhaled carefully, the chest tube shifting with the breath. He knows who pulled me back. He ran the transport logs. He knows which hospital. Emily checked the drainage output without looking up. Adequate. Still adequate. How long do we have before he arrives? If he was already moving when they called him, 40 minutes, maybe less depending on where he was stationed. A pause. Emily, if Steck walks into this room, he won't get what he came for. She made a notation in the chart. Her handwriting was steady. She was aware of this in a detached way, like watching someone else's hands. Is there anyone in your unit you can reach? Anyone you trust completely? Vasquez, Sergeant First Class Renata Vasquez. She's based out of Fort Aldrin. But I don't have my phone. They didn't transport it with me, which wasn't an accident. And using a hospital line is monitored. Yes, she thought. She was good at thinking under this kind of pressure. She'd trained for it. The thinking and the doing happening on separate parallel tracks, neither one interfering with the other. It had taken years to develop that ability. Write the number, anything you can write it on. He looked around the room. She handed him a tongue depressor and an alcohol prep pad. He wrote on the pad's wrapper in small, precise numerals. She took it, memorized the number and the time it took to read it, and slipped it into her scrub pocket. Give me 15 minutes, she said. She walked back out. The agents were still at the door. One of them made a move as if to follow her and then apparently thought better of it. Hale was at the nurse's station, on the phone, speaking too quietly. The charge nurse, Paula, had the expression of someone who wanted very badly to be somewhere else. Emily went to the medication room. It wasn't about medication. The medication room was one of 2 places on the trauma floor with no camera coverage, a bureaucratic oversight that had existed since before she'd arrived at Blackstone, and that she'd noted on her second week, the way she noted all structural details, without having any immediate use for the information. She locked the door, took out her personal cell, and called the number on the wrapper. 4 rings. 5. Who is this? Female voice. Alert, clipped. The kind of person who answered unknown numbers at 3 a.m. without audible surprise. My name doesn't matter. I'm calling from Blackstone Medical Center in Redwood Falls. I have a patient, GSW, admitted tonight, going by James Rourke on the chart, who asked me to contact you. A very brief silence. Is he alive? Currently, yes. He needs to stay that way, and there are individuals on site who I don't believe have his safety as their primary concern. Another pause, longer. Give me the address. You'll need to come in without flagging your credentials in advance. If you have a contact at the hospital administration level, don't use them tonight. She thought of Hale at the nurse's station, too quiet phone call. Use the east side entrance. Night security there is one person, older gentleman. His name is Harold. Tell him a nurse sent you. He'll understand. How long? I don't know. Move fast. She ended the call. She stood in the medication room for 10 more seconds, eyes closed, running the math. Steck incoming, 40 minutes or less. Vasquez. If she moved immediately, if she was actually at Fort Aldrin, 90 minutes minimum, possibly more. The gap between those two numbers was the problem. That was always where things went wrong. She'd learned that early, in places nothing like this hospital. She unlocked the medication room and went back to work. For the next 30 minutes, she did her job. Not because she was pretending everything was fine, she wasn't, and anyone watching her closely would have seen the particular way her attention split between her patients and the two men at Bay 7's door. But because the job mattered, and because Rourke wasn't her only patient, and because the woman in Bay 11 with the compartment syndrome she'd flagged twice needed her dressing checked, and the man in Bay 4 still had a pain management note that nobody had properly resolved. She moved through all of it with a focus that was almost meditative, and she was aware that this was the thing she'd built in Redwood Falls. Not a life exactly, but a capability for this kind of necessary presence, the ability to be exactly where she was and not 3 steps ahead or 2 years behind. It kept threatening to crack tonight. She didn't let it. At 3:08 a.m., she heard the elevator. It wasn't the sound of it that signaled the change. The elevators ran all night. It was the way the two agents at Bay 7's door responded to it, the micro-shift in their posture, the way they straightened without quite coming to attention, the practiced acknowledgement of hierarchy arriving. The man who stepped off the elevator was 60, maybe 62, with silver hair kept short and a face that had done its living in wind and bad light and high-altitude cold. He wore a suit that cost more than Emily made in 2 months, and he walked with the easy authority of someone who had never, in his adult life, entered a room unsure of his reception. Colonel Darius Steck. He paused at the nurse's station, spoke briefly to Hale, 3 sentences, hand on Hale's shoulder, the gesture of a man establishing alliance efficiently, and then he scanned the floor. His eyes found her without hesitation, which meant he already knew what she looked like, which meant the 14 months of careful nothing had meant less than she'd thought. He crossed the floor toward her. She held her ground at the supply cart she'd been working from, kept her hands visible, and waited. Nurse Carter? His voice matched his face, practiced, warm in the way that wasn't warm, the instrument of a man who'd spent decades using affability as a tool. I'm sorry to disrupt your shift. You're not disrupting it, she said. I'm working. A slight smile. He was reading her the way she was reading him, and they both knew it. I understand you've been attending to our patient. We're grateful. He's in good hands now. We have a medical team incoming who are familiar with his case. His case is a hemopneumothorax with a chest tube and a fluid balance that's been tricky all night. Whoever you're bringing in, I hope they've reviewed the chart before they take over. Of course, smooth, frictionless. I wonder if we could speak privately for a few minutes. There are aspects of Mr. Rourke's situation that would be useful for you to understand. He wanted to get her away from the floor, away from Rourke, away from the other staff, into a room where the conversation could be what he needed it to be. She'd known this was coming, had been calculating how to handle it for the better part of an hour. She didn't move from the supply cart. Whatever you need to tell me, you can tell me here. I'm not going to leave my patients unsupervised. A pause, barely visible, the adjustment of a man recalibrating. Emily, first name now, the calculated intimacy of it. I knew about your service. I knew about Task Force Ardent, and I know you've been through something that left marks. I want to help you. I don't need help. What happened to your team wasn't your fault. The inquiry wasn't complete, she said, and you know that because you had access to the full record, and the full record was never released. She looked at him steadily. Is that what you want to discuss? Because I'm happy to discuss it. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not much, just the faintest recalibration, the reassessment of a man who has underestimated resistance and is now adjusting his approach. He'd expected this to be easier. He'd expected probably what most people expected when they looked at her, the nurse who kept her head down, the woman no one paid attention to, the careful, quiet person who had built a careful, quiet life and would, rationally, want to protect it. He hadn't expected her to still be angry. She was still angry. She'd been angry for 2 years and 3 months, and she'd kept it below the surface the way you kept anything that might get you killed if you let it show too soon. But she was done keeping it down. I want to see the patient, Steck said. The warmth was gone. That's not a request. He's resting. He's post-procedure, and rest is medically indicated. I'm not asking for your medical opinion. Then you're in the wrong part of the building. She picked up the chart she'd been working with. If you have questions about his care, speak to the attending physician. If you want access to a patient in my charge without medical grounds, you'll need to go through hospital administration, and I'll need to see whatever authorizing documentation you have before I step aside. She met his eyes. That's not obstruction. That's protocol. For a moment, nothing happened. The floor was quiet around them in the particular way things go quiet when people are trying very hard to appear as though they aren't listening. Then Steck turned to Hale. One look. That was all. And Hale, to his credit, he hesitated for a full 3 seconds. She saw it. She didn't think anyone else did, but she saw it. Then he straightened his shoulders and said, Emily, why don't we give the colonel a few minutes with the patient? I'll take over the monitoring. Dr. Hale. Emily, the patient in Bay 11, she said quietly. The ortho consult I flagged. You haven't signed off on it. He blinked. She watched him decide whether this was relevant. She's been showing progressive pain in the lower left leg, increased firmness on palpation, elevated compartment pressure readings for the last 3 hours. I've documented it twice. If it's what I think it is, she needs a fasciotomy before morning rounds. And if she doesn't get it, she's looking at permanent muscle damage or worse. She kept her voice low, level, factual. I'd like that resolved before I hand off to anyone. Hale stared at her for a moment that was too long to be comfortable. Behind him, Steck was very still. Then Hale said, Show me the documentation. She walked him to the nurse's station, pulled up the notes, walked him through the vitals trend, the palpation findings she'd charted, the comparison against the admission baseline. She wasn't performing. The findings were real, and the patient needed intervention, and even in the middle of everything else that mattered. It had always mattered. That part of her had never been anything but genuine. She watched Hale's face change as he read. The shift from performed dismissal to actual attention, the good doctor under the difficult politics, the thing he was when nobody was testing his authority. He ordered the surgical consult at 3:21 a.m. and didn't make eye contact with her when he did it. She didn't need the eye contact. She needed the consult. When she turned back around, Steck had gone into Bay 7. She'd known he would. She'd made the calculation that getting the consult mattered more than the 3 minutes it had cost her, because Rourke was stable, and the Bay 11 patient's window was closing, and some things you didn't let slide, even when the world was falling apart around you. She walked back to Bay 7 and opened the door. Steck was standing at the foot of the bed. Rourke was upright, more upright than was good for him, the kind of upright you got through sheer muscle and stubbornness. And his face was completely expressionless in a way that was worse than any expression. Emily, Steck didn't turn around when she entered. Mr. Rourke and I were just discussing the circumstances of his transport. He seems to believe there are some inconsistencies. There are inconsistencies, Rourke said. His voice was even. The wound trajectory doesn't match a front-facing engagement. The shot came from a position that would have required advanced knowledge of my extraction coordinates. And the choice of hospital, his eyes moved to Emily, brief, then back, suggests the transport itself was directed. You've been through significant trauma. Steck's voice was gentle in the way that was designed to infuriate. It's understandable that... Don't, Rourke said it without heat. Don't do the trauma confusion thing. I've used it myself. It doesn't work on me. A pause. Steck finally turned to look at Emily. Whatever he's told you, I'd like to know, she said, who authorized the federal security hold on this patient? Specifically, name, rank, and filing agency. Because Federal Security Office isn't a designation I'm finding in any directory I have access to. It's a classified, then I'd like to see the classification documentation, in writing, presented to hospital administration, logged, so that if anything happens to this patient in the next 12 hours, there's a clear record of who authorized what. She held his gaze. That's not complicated. That's just paperwork. Steck looked at her for a long time. She thought about Pemberton and about the call sign and about a night she would never fully describe to anyone who hadn't been there. She thought about 6 people dead and a report that had been filed and amended again until it no longer resembled what had actually happened. She thought about how long she'd been afraid. She was not, in this moment, afraid. You should be careful, Steck said quietly, about the position you're putting yourself in. I'm a nurse, she said. I'm standing in a patient's room. The position seems clear to me. He left. Not fast. He moved with the deliberate unhurry of a man who needed to appear unhurried. But he left, and she let out a breath so carefully it barely registered. Rourke watched the door close. Then, quietly, Vasquez? Called. She's coming. How long? Too long, she said honestly. But we don't need Vasquez for the next hour. We just need to not be stupid for the next hour. He almost smiled. Almost. You know he's going to come back with people. I know. And you know the documentation request buys maybe 30 minutes. 25, she said. I know his type. He already has it drafted. He just needed time to make it look like it wasn't drafted in advance. She checked the monitors again. Try to rest. I'm serious. You lose any more pressure and the chest tube stops being enough, and then I have a different problem. Emily. She turned. He was looking at her with something she hadn't seen from him yet. Not the threat assessment, not the controlled reserve, something more direct. Pemberton said you were the best medic he'd ever served with. Said the reason your team trusted you completely was because you never once put the mission above the people. A pause. He also said you blamed yourself for what happened. She said nothing. For the record, Rourke said, whatever the record is worth, you didn't cause it. She turned back to the monitors. Her hands were steady. That was the important thing. Get some sleep, she said. She was in the hallway at 3:44 a.m. when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered on the second ring. It's Pemberton. Her throat closed for exactly 1 second. Dale. Yeah. His voice was rough with sleep and something underneath the sleep that sounded like guilt and possibly relief. She couldn't tell from 500 miles away. You called Harlow. Someone found me. I know, I heard. I'm sorry, Em. I didn't... He stopped. She could hear him pulling himself together. I didn't know they'd move this fast. I didn't know Steck was still active. Steck is on site right now. Silence. Jesus. I need everything you have on him, whatever you pulled when you were trying to figure out what happened to the team, whatever you never filed. She kept her voice low, one eye on the corridor. I need it verifiable, and I need it transferable, digital, on a server somewhere that isn't government adjacent. If I send that, Dale, she waited. Send it. A long pause. She could hear him breathing. Then, 3 years ago, 6 months before the Ardent operation, there was an internal audit on mission logistics. 2 names flagged for irregular communication patterns. One of them was Steck's handler at the time. The other name was Steck. Another pause. The audit was closed. Reason cited was inconclusive data. The officer who ran the audit transferred out 6 weeks later. She pressed her back against the wall. Down the corridor, one of Steck's agents had reappeared at the elevator bank, not moving toward her, just present. Who closed it? She said. The name on the closure order is Brigadier General Norris Calloway. His voice was flat now. The flatness of someone who had spent a long time being angry about something he couldn't prove. Currently serving as Deputy Director of Operations, Joint Command. She absorbed that. The size of it. The reach of it. "I'm sending the files," Pemberton said. "Encrypted. You'll need the key." "It's the date of your commissioning," spelled out, no spaces. A pause. These people have a long reach." "I know." "If Steck is there in person—" "He came for me," she said. "Not Rourke. Rourke was the bait." She watched the agent at the elevator bank. He was on a phone now, back partly turned. "He needs something I have. Or he needs something I know. I haven't figured out which yet." "Both," Pemberton said. Think about it. You were there. You were the only ardent medic who survived and who didn't sign the amended after-action report. You're the only one who can testify to what the original report said. And you—" He stopped. "What?" A longer pause than she'd expected. "The night before the operation. Do you remember the equipment check? You documented it yourself. Individual accountability forms for each team member's kit." "Yes." "Those forms would show what equipment each person had, what communication devices, what was on and what was off." His voice had gone careful. "If Steck's coordination with the other side happened via a device that was supposed to be logged as inactive, those forms would show it." She stood very still. She remembered the equipment check. She remembered being thorough about it because she was always thorough, because thoroughness was the habit you built when the alternative was coming home in a bag. She remembered logging every item, every device. She remembered one entry that had seemed strange at the time. A communication unit logged by a senior officer as inactive that she'd noted was warm to the touch had been recently used. She'd logged it exactly as she'd found it. A warm device logged as inactive. She'd never told anyone. She hadn't known what it meant. She'd just documented what she saw, the way she always did, and then everything had gone wrong so fast that the form had seemed like the least important thing in the world. "Dale," she said, "where are those forms now?" "That's the question." His voice was quiet. "Because officially, they were destroyed with the rest of the Arden administrative record when the operation was closed out." "Officially." "You made copies," he said. "I watched you. You always made copies of your accountability forms. Field habit." She had made copies. She didn't say that. She looked at the agent at the elevator bank, who had finished his phone call and was now looking directly at her. She looked back. And then, from the direction of the east stairwell, the one that led up from the side entrance, where an older security guard named Harold worked the night shift, she heard the door open. A woman came through first, late 30s, compact, moving with the contained efficiency of someone who was always half a second from being somewhere dangerous. She had a duffel over one shoulder, and she was scanning the floor before she'd cleared the stairwell door, eyes catching Emily's and holding, reading, assessing. Sergeant First Class Renata Vasquez. She hadn't come alone. Behind her were two men, younger, same build, same quality of attention, and a third person Emily didn't recognize. A woman in civilian clothes carrying what looked like a hard-sided case for electronics. Vasquez reached Emily in 12 steps and didn't extend a hand. "You're Rourke's nurse." "Yes." "He's alive. Stable. Chest tube, fluid line, needs about 4 more hours of monitoring before anyone should be moving him." Vasquez looked down the corridor toward Bay 7, took in the agents, took in Steck, visible through the interior window of the nurse's station where he'd apparently set up a temporary command position. Her jaw moved slightly. "Steck. Arrived 40 minutes ago. He knows who you are. He came for me specifically. Rourke was transport." She met Vasquez's eyes. "I have documentation, encrypted. I need someone with the right clearance level and zero connection to Joint Command to verify it." Vasquez glanced at the woman with the hard-sided case. Something passed between them. "She can verify it." "Then we have a window," Emily said, "but it's closing. Steck drafted custody paperwork on the way here. Once he files it—" "He won't file it." Vasquez said it flat, certain. "Not if what Pemberton sent me in the last 20 minutes is what I think it is." She looked at Emily directly. Is there somewhere on this floor where 4 people can work without being on camera? Emily thought of the medication room, of the blind spot in Bay 7's upper left corner, of the maintenance corridor behind radiology. Yes, she said. They moved toward the stairwell access point, and the agent at the elevator bank was already reaching for his radio, and Steck was standing up inside the nurse's station with the particular posture of a man who has just realized that the situation is no longer what he believed it to be. And from Bay 7, visible through the interior window, Rourke had pulled himself upright again with that infuriating stubbornness, and he was watching the corridor, and even from 30 feet away, Emily could see that he had recognized Vasquez, and that something in his expression had shifted from controlled endurance to something that might, in better light, have looked like relief. Steck picked up the desk phone. Emily watched him dial. She counted the seconds. She thought about a warm communication device logged as inactive and a form she'd made a copy of because she was always thorough and a team of people who had trusted her completely, most of whom were no longer alive. She thought about what it meant that Steck needed those forms badly enough to burn an active mission, compromise a soldier, and drive personally to a regional hospital in upstate New York at 3 in the morning. Vasquez touched her arm. "We need to move." "I know," Emily said, and didn't move yet, because she was watching Steck's face on the other end of that phone call, watching the confidence shift into something else, watching him hear something that made him go very still, made him set the phone down carefully, made him turn and look through the glass at the hallway with the eyes of a man who has just discovered that the trap he set has been rebuilt around him. He looked at her. She turned and walked toward the stairwell. Behind her, she heard the phone on the nurse's station ring again, and then stop. The stairwell door had barely swung shut behind them when the hospital's overhead PA system clicked on. Not the normal soft chime that preceded routine announcements, but a hard double tone that Emily had never heard in 14 months at Blackstone. "Attention all staff. Blackstone Medical Center is now under a facility security protocol. All non-essential personnel are asked to remain in their current locations. All patient access points are being secured. Please await further instruction from administration." Vasquez stopped on the landing. "That's him." "That's fast," Emily said. "He had it ready." Vasquez looked at the woman with the hard case, whose name, Emily had gathered from the stairwell, was Dara Fenn, and who had the kind of stillness that suggested she was not a soldier, but had spent enough time around soldiers that the difference barely mattered. "How long do you need?" "Depends on what she has," Fenn said, looking at Emily. Emily thought about the copies. She'd moved them twice since leaving the service. Once when she'd relocated the first time. Once when she'd come to Redwood Falls. They were on a drive the size of a thumb, sitting inside a hollowed-out space behind the electrical panel in her apartment on Delancey Street, because that was the kind of hiding place that worked not through sophistication, but through the simple fact that nobody looked there. 20 minutes to retrieve it, she said. "I'm not on site." Vasquez took that in without visible frustration, which Emily appreciated. "Where?" "Apartment. 12 minutes by car if the roads are clear at this hour." "They won't let you leave the building. Not now." One of the 2 men behind Vasquez, broad, quiet, had said nothing yet, spoke for the first time. "Steck's agents will have the exits." "Not all of them," Emily said. She was already thinking about the maintenance corridor behind radiology, the one that ran parallel to the service road on the building's north side and exited through a loading bay used for medical waste removal. The loading bay was on a different access system than the main exits, a card reader that ran off the facility's management database, not the security protocol system. She had a facilities access card because she'd been part of the trauma floor renovation committee 8 months ago, and nobody had ever deactivated it. She told Vasquez this in about 30 seconds flat. Vasquez looked at the quiet man. "Tran, go with her." "I don't need," Emily started. "You do." Vasquez said it without argument, which meant there wasn't going to be one. "Rourke is 3 floors up in a room with 2 of Steck's people outside the door and a chest tube that's going to need attention in the next 2 hours. I need you back in this building and functional. Tran keeps you functional." She met Emily's eyes. "That's not a critique of your capability. That's math." Emily accepted it because it was math. Tran didn't introduce himself beyond the name Vasquez had used. He was maybe 30, moved quietly. and as they went down through the maintenance corridor, he stayed half a step behind and slightly left, covering her blind side without being asked, which meant he'd done this before, and that she could trust his positioning without thinking about it. That was useful. The loading bay was dark and cold, and smelled like industrial cleaner, and the particular sharpness of October coming through the rubber seal on the bay doors. Her card reader worked. They were outside in under a minute. Her car was a 6-year-old Civic that she'd bought with cash and maintained herself. She drove it hard and without conversation, and Tran rode in the passenger seat with his hands visible on his knees, which she noted and appreciated. The apartment on Delancey took 4 minutes. She was up the stairs and through the door and at the electrical panel inside of 90 seconds, working the panel cover off with practiced efficiency. The drive was where she'd left it, taped behind the secondary breaker with a strip of electrical tape that had been there so long it had fused slightly to the metal. She was on her way back down the stairs when her phone buzzed. Pemberton. "They're running your name through the hospital administration system," he said without preamble. "Pulling your employment records, your transfer history. Someone's trying to build a case for unauthorized disclosure of classified—" "They can build whatever they want," she said. "Does it hold?" "Not if the documents get to the right people before they complete the filing." A pause. Callaway is involved. I confirmed it 20 minutes ago. The authorization for Steck's operation tonight. It goes up the chain to Callaway's office." She was already back in the car. Tran was watching the street behind them without appearing to watch it. "How high does this go, Dale?" Silence for 3 seconds. 4. "High enough that the right people aren't inside the system. You need someone outside it." She thought about Fenn and the hard-sided electronics case. Working on it. She drove. They were back at the loading bay at 4:19 a.m. Vasquez met them at the corridor entrance, and Emily handed her the drive without ceremony. Fenn had set up her equipment on a rolling cart in the corner of the maintenance corridor. A laptop, an encrypted router, something else that Emily didn't recognize, but which Fenn was interfacing with through a cable she'd pulled from the hard-sided case. "Give me 8 minutes, Fenn said. 8 minutes was a long time right now, and everyone present understood that without saying it. Emily took the maintenance corridor back up toward the trauma floor. Vasquez caught her arm before she cleared the stairwell. "What's Rourke's actual status?" "He lost more blood than the initial assessment showed. The chest tube is managing the hemothorax, but his pressure has been inconsistent. He needs the tube for at least another 4 hours. He needs the fluid line maintained, and he absolutely cannot be moved by people who don't understand why." She looked at Vasquez steadily. "Whatever's about to happen up there, he needs to stay in that room." Understood. Vasquez's face was harder to read than Rourke's, which was already difficult. "One more thing. The agents Steck brought in, 4 that we've counted. There may be more in the building we haven't identified." "The orderly," Emily said, "3rd floor. I clocked him earlier. Already repositioned. Tran's team has eyes on all 4 visible contacts." A pause. "Steck himself is the variable. He's been on the phone since you left. We don't know who he's calling." "Callaway," Emily said. "He's calling Callaway." Vasquez absorbed that. "Then we need Fenn to move faster." They went up. The trauma floor at 4:23 a.m. was a different thing than it had been an hour ago. The security protocol had stripped it of the ordinary ambient noise, fewer staff visible, the ones present moving tight and careful, the PA-induced tension sitting on everything like pressure before a storm. Hale was at the nurse's station, not on the phone now, just sitting with a coffee he wasn't drinking, and an expression that belonged to a man who had realized he'd agreed to something without understanding what he was agreeing to. Steck was still in the nurse's station interior. He saw Emily the moment she came through the stairwell door, and he straightened, and even from 40 feet away she could see the recalculation happening in his expression. She'd left the building, she'd come back, she'd brought someone, and now he had to revise his working model of how threatening she was. She let him revise it. She went straight to Bay 7. Rourke's drainage output had increased by 40 milliliters in the last hour. She noted it and adjusted the fluid rate by a small margin, not enough to be alarming, enough to be correct. His blood pressure was low normal, which was the best available option. He watched her work. "Vasquez is here," she said quietly. "I know. I saw her come through." He tracked the agents outside the door through the interior window. Steck made 2 calls in the last 30 minutes, both short. Calling up the chain. Whoever's on the other end of those calls is the real problem. His voice had the careful quality of someone choosing each word with a specific purpose. Emily, the equipment form. The one from the Ardent accountability check. I have it. If it shows what I think it shows. He stopped. His jaw worked. There was a communication unit, senior officer. I was briefed after the operation that it had malfunctioned, that the malfunction was a contributing factor to the team losing coordination. He looked at her directly. But I always thought that was... It wasn't a malfunction, she said. She kept her voice absolutely level because the alternative was not an option right now. The device was active. I logged it as active. The amended after-action report changed that entry. He was quiet for a moment. Who amended it? The signature on the amendment was a Lieutenant Colonel Hargreaves, who transferred out of the unit 6 weeks after the Ardent audit was closed. Hargreaves. He said the name like he was placing something. Hargreaves is currently Steck's chief of staff. She hadn't known that. She kept her face still. So the man who falsified the record is now running logistics for the man who authorized tonight's operation, she said. And if your form shows the device was active, Rourke said, then the malfunction story collapses. And if the malfunction story collapses, the whole after-action narrative collapses. And if that collapses, everything built on top of it collapses, she said. The monitors beeped. Normal. She double-checked the chest tube connection out of habit. The door to Bay 7 opened. Steck came in alone, which meant he'd made a decision about approach. He looked at Rourke first, then at Emily, then at the monitors. He was doing the thing where you look calm by controlling the speed of your movements. She'd used the same technique herself and recognized it for what it was. I have authorization documents, he said. He held up a folder. Signed, logged. The patient is being transferred to a secure medical facility within the hour. I need you to prepare him for transport. He can't be transported, Emily said. The chest tube, our medical team will manage the chest tube. A chest tube managing an active hemopneumothorax cannot be safely transferred without a minimum 4-hour post-procedure stability window. He's at 90 minutes. Moving him now risks tension pneumothorax, which kills him. She held Steck's eyes. If that happens during your authorized transfer, the authorization documents are what connects your name to his death. Steck stared at her. Something moved through his expression that she had no name for. Not quite anger, not quite the smooth authority he'd been performing since he arrived. Something older and more cornered. You've been an inconvenience, he said quietly. Not a threat. An observation, which was somehow worse. I've been a nurse, she said, doing my job. His phone buzzed. He looked at it, and whatever he saw on the screen made a small muscle in his jaw tighten in a way that he probably didn't know was visible. He typed something short and put it back in his pocket. Rourke had been watching him the whole time. Bad news? His voice was controlled. Specifically, carefully controlled. Preparation for transport, Steck said. 30 minutes. He looked at Emily one last time, and in the look was something she read as a decision. The kind of decision that people made when they had calculated that the clean option was no longer available. I'd recommend you think very carefully about your next move, Nurse Carter. He left. She was at Rourke's side in the same second the door closed. He's going to move faster now. Something changed in the last 5 minutes. The calls he made. Rourke's voice was low. Whatever Calloway told him. Her phone. Not the personal one. The hospital-issued cell she kept in her left scrub pocket, the one she barely used. Buzzing now. Unknown number, which it shouldn't be. The hospital system identified all internal calls. She answered. This is Special Agent Maureen Dark, Military Criminal Investigative Division, Joint Oversight Command. Female voice, direct, moving at the speed of someone who didn't have time for the normal conversational scaffolding. I need to speak with Emily Carter. I was told she's in this building. Emily's hand tightened around the phone. Speaking. We have been monitoring communication traffic out of Blackstone Medical Center for the past 40 minutes based on a report filed by Sergeant First Class Vasquez at 0340 hours. I am currently 12 minutes from your location. A brief pause. Do not let Steck move that patient. I've been trying to... He just received an order from Calloway's office to accelerate the timeline. We intercepted it 6 minutes ago. He's going to move in the next 20 minutes with or without medical clearance. Another pause. Is the documentation we discussed with Vasquez accessible? Being processed now. We need a chain of custody that holds. Everything from the moment you retrieve that drive needs to be documented. Who had it, when, what was accessed. Dark's voice was sharp and not unkind. Can you do that? Yes. Good. 12 minutes. Keep him in that room. The call ended. Emily looked at Rourke. He'd heard enough from the one-sided exchange to understand the shape of it. His face was still that studied blankness, but his eyes were doing the calculations she recognized from her own reflection. 12 minutes, she said. Steck moves in 20. I know. 8-minute window where he can still get me out of this building before oversight arrives. Yes. He looked at the chest tube, at the fluid line, at the monitors, then at her, with the particular directness of a man who had made his peace with a set of bad options and was asking her to do the same. What do you need from me? He said. She was already at the door, already looking down the corridor at Steck, who had gathered his 2 agents and was speaking low and fast with the energy of a man compressing a timeline. Behind her, the monitors beeped steady, the chest tube drained slow, and somewhere in the maintenance corridor 3 floors below, Dara Fenn was 8 minutes into working through documents that could unravel a 3-year cover-up if she had enough time to authenticate them. Steck looked up. He looked at Emily. He nodded to the agent on his left. The agent began moving toward Bay 7. She stepped into the doorway of Bay 7 before the agent reached it. Not aggressive, not wide stance blocking, just present, standing in the threshold with her arms at her sides and her weight evenly distributed and her face doing the thing it had been doing all night, which was nothing in particular. The agent, younger than she'd initially clocked, mid-30s, the particular jaw set of someone who'd been told this was going to be simple, stopped 2 feet from her. Ma'am, I need you to step aside. He's not stable for transport, she said. I've documented that. If you have contradicting medical opinion, I'd like to see it in writing before anything changes in this room. We have a medical team. Where are they? She looked past him, down the corridor. No one knew on the floor. Because if your team is here and prepared to take over care, I'd like to do a proper handoff. Current vitals, chest tube output log, fluid balance, medication record. That takes about 8 minutes when it's done correctly. She looked back at him. Or we can skip it, and when something goes wrong in the elevator, we'll know whose documentation was missing. He didn't have an answer for that. Agents generally didn't. Medical liability was the specific kind of language that created pause in people who hadn't thought about it. He looked back at Steck. Steck made a small motion with his hand. Come anyway. Do it. She'd expected that. She stepped aside, not because she was giving up, but because the math had changed. Fighting the agent in the doorway burned time she didn't have, and gave Steck grounds to have her physically removed from the floor, which would be worse. She went to the monitors instead, making herself essential in the most visible, documentable way possible. Checking the chest tube, logging the output by hand in the paper chart, which nobody used anymore because paper was harder to alter than digital records. What are you doing? The agent said. My job. She wrote the time in the margin. 4:31. If this patient is being transferred, this is the record that travels with him. I want it complete. Steck was in the room now. He looked at Rourke, and whatever passed between those 2 men in that 3-second exchange was old and ugly and not something Emily was part of. Rourke looked back at him with a steadiness that cost something. She could see the cost in the set of his shoulders, the careful management of his breathing around the chest tube. James, Steck said, this doesn't have to be complicated. You shot me, Rourke said, flat, not loud. That's not a metaphor, not complicated. You set the coordinates, you positioned the shooter, and you made sure I ended up in a specific hospital because you needed something you couldn't get any other way. He held Steck's gaze without blinking. How long have you known she was here? Steck didn't answer. 6 months? A year? A pause. Long enough to run the operation properly. You just needed a reason that didn't look like what it was. You should be resting, Steck said. The warmth was entirely gone now. What remained was the frame of the man without the performance, something much colder and more functional. He turned to Emily. Prepare him. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't reach for it. Nurse Carter, the PA system clicked on again. But it wasn't the same double tone as before. This was different. A single chime, the kind that preceded a facility-wide announcement from administration, the kind that required administrator-level access to broadcast. Everyone in the room went still. Attention Blackstone Medical Center staff and security personnel. This is Special Agent Maureen Dark, Military Criminal Investigative Division. Joint Oversight Command. Badge number MCI 4471. I am currently on site. All security protocols enacted in the last 2 hours are hereby suspended pending federal oversight review. Staff are instructed to resume normal operations. Any personnel restricting patient access or staff movement without standard hospital authorization are advised to cease immediately. Further instruction will follow. Silence. 4 seconds of it. Then Steck moved toward the door, and his face was the face of a man who has just heard the sound of something he built coming apart. He had his phone out. He was already dialing. The agent in the room looked at his partner in the corridor. Something passed between them. Not panic, but the particular recalibration of people who work within structures and have just been told the structure has shifted. Emily went back to the chart. She wrote the next line of monitoring data. Her hand was steady. Rourke watched her. 8 minutes, he said quietly. 7 now, she said. They moved fast. Dark. He said the name like he was placing it. MCID. She's been building a case. Apparently. She noted the blood pressure. Longer than tonight, I think. How much longer? She thought about the phone call, the speed of Dark's information, the fact that she'd been monitoring communication traffic out of Blackstone before Vasquez had even reached the floor, which meant she'd known about Rourke's location before Vasquez filed anything, which meant she'd been watching Steck's operation as it unfolded in real time. Long enough, Emily said. The next 8 minutes were the kind that compressed unevenly. Steck in the corridor, 2 phone calls, the second one clearly going badly. She could see it through the interior window, the progressive deterioration of his composure, the point at which the voice on the other end of the line apparently stopped being helpful and became something else. One of his agents disappeared toward the elevator. The other stayed outside the door, but with a different quality of presence. Less blocking, more waiting. Darky came through the stairwell door at 4:39 a.m. She was shorter than Emily had expected from the voice. Early 50s, dark hair cut practical, wearing a jacket over civilian clothes that she'd clearly thrown on in a hurry because the collar was slightly askew. She had 2 people with her, both in clearer federal identification than anything Steck had produced. She took in the floor in about 4 seconds, clocked Steck in the corridor, and went straight to him without slowing down. Emily watched through the window. She couldn't hear it. She didn't need to. The body language translated across 30 feet of glass, Dark presenting credentials. Steck responding with the posture of a man who still believed his rank would function here. Dark saying something short and specific that made that belief visibly recalibrate. Steck's agent stepping in and then stepping back when one of Dark's people turned to look at him. Vasquez appeared at Emily's shoulder. Fen finished. Emily turned. All of it? Authenticated. Chain of custody logged from the moment you handed it over. The equipment accountability form is in there, time-stamped against the original document database. She found the amendment record too, the version that shows what was changed, what was added, what was deleted. Vasquez paused. The original entry, the one you made. It's intact. The amendment is dated 6 weeks after the Ardent audit was closed. Hargreaves' digital signature is on it. Emily let that settle. 2 years and 3 months of carrying something she couldn't prove, something she wasn't even certain anyone would believe. And it had been there the entire time. Just archived, altered, buried under the bureaucratic weight of a closed file. Where's the file now? She said. Dark secure server. Also transmitted to 2 independent military law offices that Fen works with. Vasquez almost smiled. Not quite. Redundant copies. Steck can't pull it back. Emily looked through the glass. Steck was still talking, but the quality of the conversation had changed. She could see it in how he was holding himself, the shift from authority to argument. Dark was listening without expression, which was its own answer. She went back to Rourke. His drainage output had stabilized in the last 30 minutes, which was the first genuinely good number of the night. She adjusted the fluid rate marginally and wrote it down. "It's done," she said. He looked at her. "The documentation is authenticated. Chain of custody secured. Dark has it." A long pause. He looked at the ceiling, then back at her. He didn't say anything for a moment that stretched long enough to hold the weight of what it meant. The operation, the team, the 3 years of a story told wrong, the months she'd spent in this hospital being nobody. His jaw moved once, that was all. "Dale Pemberton," he said finally. "He okay?" "He's the reason we have half of what we have tonight." "Good." A pause. "He always said you'd be the one who wouldn't sign the amended report. Said you were too stubborn." "I prefer thorough." "Same thing." He almost said something else. Didn't. She understood. There were things that would take time to say properly, and 4:40 in the morning in a trauma room was not the time. She heard the corridor change. Not a sound exactly, more the quality of movement outside the door, the shift in density that happened when the number of bodies in a space increased quickly. She was at the window before she'd consciously decided to move. Darka had been joined by 2 more people, male, suited, the particular posture of federal investigators, not security personnel. Steck's remaining agent had stepped back from the doorway. Steck himself was standing very still, which was worse than movement. Still meant he'd stopped performing and started calculating. Then Dark's hand came out with documents. She offered them to Steck. He didn't take them immediately, which was a tell. He read the header from where he stood first, which meant he was trying to assess before committing to a reaction. Then he took them, read, turned the page, stopped at something. His face did a thing she hadn't seen from him all night. The composure didn't break. It was more like watching ice not break but crack internally. The surface still intact, everything underneath it suddenly compromised. He looked up from the documents. He looked through the interior window. He looked at Emily. She held his gaze. She was aware this was probably not the tactically humble thing to do. She did it anyway. Dark said something else to him, short. He didn't respond. One of the male investigators moved to his left side, not touching him, just present, proximate, in the specific way that communicated what was about to happen before it happened. Steck handed the documents back. He straightened his jacket, which was an automatic movement, the muscle memory of a man who had spent decades managing his appearance. Then he said something to Dark. 1 sentence, maybe 2. Darky nodded once. Steck reached into his jacket and produced his phone and his credentials, and placed both on the nurse's station desk with the careful deliberateness of a man who is no longer pretending the situation is negotiable. It wasn't an arrest. Not yet. But it was the moment before one. And everyone on the floor knew it. Hale was standing near the supply alcove, coffee still in his hand, watching. The night-charged nurse, Paula, had come out from behind the station and was standing with her arms crossed, not looking away. 2 overnight techs near the far end of the floor had stopped pretending to be doing something else. The floor was watching. Dark came into Base 7 without knocking, which was the first time Emily had seen her use impatience as a tool. She looked at Rourke first. Clinical assessment, quick, the kind of person who checked the patient before the paperwork. Then at Emily. "You had it the whole time," she said. "I had a copy," Emily said. "I didn't know if it was enough." "It was enough." Dark put the folder on the side table. "The authentication confirms the original Arden accountability form, including the entry regarding the active communication device. It directly contradicts the amended after-action report. Combined with the communication intercepts from tonight," she paused, "and the financial records we've been building separately for the past 11 months, we have what we need for Steck, for Hargreaves, and for Calloway." The name landed in the room. Rourke said nothing. His jaw was tight. "Calloway's office authorized tonight's operation," Dark continued. "That makes him directly liable for what happened to Mr. Rourke. Combined with his role in closing the Ardent audit, the audit that should have flagged Steck years ago. We have a chain of accountability that goes from the field operation all the way to the deputy director of operations. Emily thought about what that meant, the size of it, the reach. She'd known it was big. Pemberton had told her as much, but hearing it stated with that flat federal precision made it real in a different way. Calloway is being contacted by the Inspector General's office at this moment, Dark said. His travel is restricted pending investigation. He'll have lawyers on the phone in 10 minutes, Rourke said. He already does. Dark looked at him steadily. It won't be fast. I want you to know that. This kind of case, the legal process takes time. Court-martial proceedings, the review board, the evidence chain, it won't be resolved tonight or next week. I know how it works, he said, but it will be resolved. She said it without drama, which made it more convincing than drama would have. The families of the Ardent team will be contacted, formally, with the actual record. She paused. That part we can do quickly. Emily looked at the monitors. She looked at the chest tube. She made a note in the paper chart because her hands needed something to do, and the chart was real, and the numbers in it were real, and right now that mattered. There's one more thing, Dark said. She was looking at Emily. Steck made a call from the nurses' station 42 minutes ago, before we intercepted the Calloway communication. The call was short, under 90 seconds, and we weren't monitoring that line yet. She paused. We don't know who he called or what was said. The room absorbed that. He'd been running this for months, Emily said. He has other people. Yes. Dark didn't soften it. We don't know who or what he activated in that call. It may be nothing, a contingency that won't be triggered now that the operation is compromised, or it may be something that was already in motion before he made the call. Operational insurance, Rourke said quietly. If he was smart enough to run this for 3 years without getting caught, he was smart enough to have a fallback. That's our concern. Dark looked at both of them. The hospital is being secured by MCID personnel as of 15 minutes ago. Steck's agents have been contained. But I want you both to understand that until we know what that call set in motion, we treat this as ongoing. Emily nodded. She was already running it. Exits, sight lines, the number of MCID personnel she'd counted versus the size of the building. The maintenance corridor, the loading bay. She thought about the 3 floors between her and the ground level and the fact that Rourke still had a chest tube and couldn't be moved safely for at least 90 more minutes. I'm going to ask you to stay on this floor, Dark said to Emily. Not a command, a request, which was a different and more respectful thing. Mr. Rourke's care is your domain. I'd like that to continue. He's not going anywhere for 90 minutes, Emily said. Neither am I. Dark left. The door closed. The room was quieter than it had been in hours, the specific quiet of a situation that has found its new shape and not yet shown whether that shape will hold. Vasquez was outside. She'd be watching the floor. Tran and the other one, whose name Emily still hadn't gotten, had positioned themselves in the corridor in the casual way of people who were very much not casual. Ben was probably still in the maintenance level with her equipment, running redundancy checks. Emily sat down in the chair beside the bed. First time she'd sat down in 6 hours. The chair was the standard hospital issue. Hard plastic seat, slightly too low. And it was one of the least comfortable chairs she'd sat in, and she didn't care at all. Rourke watched her settle. You're not going to sleep. No? But you sat down. Remarkable observation. She checked the drainage bag. Still adequate. Your platelet count is going to start being a concern if we don't get some labs drawn in the next hour. I'm going to order a panel. Emily. She looked at him. Thank you, he said. Simple, direct. The way he said everything. She looked at the monitors for a moment. Pemberton's the one you should be thanking. He kept the thread alive. Pemberton told me where to find you. You're the one who... He stopped. You didn't have to stay. When Steck showed up, you could have handed off the care and walked away, and technically nobody could have said you'd done anything wrong. I know. Why didn't you? She thought about it honestly. About the 14 months. About the apartment with the broken blinds. About the way she'd built something careful and small and quiet, and how she'd known, in the back of herself, that it was only ever a delay. Because I was tired of it, she said. Simple as that. He nodded. He understood simple as that. She thought he probably lived most of his life in simple as that, and so did she. And that was maybe the most honest thing that had passed between them. She ordered the lab panel. She documented the vitals. She adjusted the fluid line and logged the adjustment and checked the time, 5:07 a.m., and calculated that they needed another 73 minutes of stability before transport could even be considered, and that 73 minutes was a manageable number. She was writing the next chart note when the power went out. Not partial. Not a flicker. Full. The monitors, the overhead lights, the ventilator alarm that started screaming on battery backup 2 seconds later in Bay 9 down the hall, the emergency lighting kicking on in a low red-orange glow that made everything look like something else. Rourke was upright before she'd processed what happened. Stay down. Generator. I know. She was already at the door. The backup power should have caught the monitors within 8 seconds. Standard hospital emergency protocol. She counted. 8 seconds, 9, 11. The monitors in Bay 7 did not come back on. She looked at the fluid line, still running. Gravity feed, not pump dependent, so the fluid was continuing. The chest tube was passive drainage, also not power dependent. Rourke was breathing. Those were the things that mattered, and she ran through them fast and clinical while her mind was already 3 steps ahead. The backup generator failure was not accidental. The timing was not coincidental. Steck had made a call 42 minutes ago, and whatever that call had set in motion, it had just arrived. Vasquez was at the door. The emergency lighting caught the hard lines of her face. Generator room. Someone cut the transfer switch. Tran is on it. How long? 10-15 minutes to restore. Emily looked at Rourke. In the red-orange emergency light, hooked to a chest tube and a gravity feed, he looked exactly like what he was. A man who was not well, who was nonetheless already mentally mapping the room for options, which was both admirable and deeply inconvenient. He can't move, she said to Vasquez. Whatever's coming, we hold this room. Agreed. Vasquez was already on her radio, clipped and fast, calling positions. Down the corridor in the strange flat light, Emily could see Dark's people moving, 2 toward the stairwell, 1 toward the elevator bank. The configuration of people who know an entry point is being tested and are covering the likely ones. She could see Hale still at the nurses' station, standing now, coffee long abandoned, and 2 other nurses who hadn't gone home yet clustered near the far wall. She could see that the door to the north stairwell, the one farthest from the elevator bank, the one she'd used to go down to the maintenance level, was open. It had been closed 10 minutes ago. She was about to call it out when she saw a figure come through it, not running, walking, with the contained, deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going and didn't need to hurry to get there. The figure stopped in the corridor light. It was Hargreaves. She'd never seen a photograph, but she knew it was him the same way she'd have known it was anyone who moved like that, with the residual authority of rank worn so long it had become posture. He was carrying nothing visible. He didn't look toward Dark's people or Vasquez or the cluster of hospital staff. He looked at Bay 7. He looked at her. And from somewhere behind him, coming through the same open stairwell door, were 2 more figures that Emily's eyes resolved into something that made the back of her neck go cold. Because they weren't Steck's agents, and they weren't MCID, and they weren't carrying the kind of credentials that got waved around in hallways. Vasquez's radio crackled. Tran's voice, "Tran, north stairwell, we have a problem." And then static. Hargreaves took 1 more step forward into the emergency light, and his face was the face of a man who had been the kind of careful and patient that 3 years of a successful cover-up required, and who had not come to this hospital tonight to be arrested. He had come to make sure the only person who could testify to the original Ardent record never had the chance to do it. Emily stepped back into Bay 7 and closed the door. "Rourke," she said, "we have a problem." Rourke didn't ask questions. That was the thing about him. He assessed and he moved, and right now moving meant getting his legs over the side of the bed despite the chest tube and the fluid line, and the fact that his blood pressure had been inconsistent for 6 hours. "Stay down," she said. "I mean it." "You said we have a problem." "I can manage the problem without you tearing the tube loose and bleeding into your chest cavity." She was already at the supply cabinet on the wall, pulling it open, running her eyes over the contents with the speed of someone who knew exactly what was there because she'd inventoried it 3 days ago out of habit. Hargreaves is in the corridor, 2 others with him. Tran's radio cut out. Tran can handle. I don't know what Tran can handle right now because his radio cut out. She turned around. What I know is that Hargreaves didn't come up here to negotiate. He came because Steck made a call and Hargreaves was the call, which means he's been close this whole time, waiting. She met his eyes. He wants the documentation gone and the witness gone, and he has maybe 4 minutes before Dark's people work out where he is. Rourke looked at her steadily. What do you need? I need you to stay on that bed and not pull anything out of your chest. She pulled 2 items from the cabinet, a blood pressure cuff and a pulse oximeter that she clipped to her own finger, not his, and then she did something she hadn't done in 2 years and 3 months. She picked up the landline on the wall and dialed internal security. It rang 4 times. Harold picked up. Harold, she said, north stairwell, 3rd floor, right now. Bring whoever you have. Emily, please. She hung up. She positioned herself at the door with her hand on the frame and watched the corridor through the narrow window inset in the upper panel. Emergency lighting, red-orange. Hargreaves had stopped advancing. He was 15 feet from Bay 7, and the 2 figures behind him had spread laterally, which was tactical positioning, which meant they'd done this kind of thing before and were not hospital security and not federal agents. Vasquez was visible at the far end of the corridor, radio in hand, and Emily watched her clock Hargreaves and make a calculation in about 1 second flat. Vasquez moved toward him. Stop! Hargreaves' voice carried through the door. Calm, the specific calm of someone who had decided the outcome of the next 3 minutes and was simply executing it. Sergeant, you're going to want to think about what you do next. Already thought about it, Vasquez said. She didn't slow down. You're Hargreaves. Stand down. No. One of the 2 figures moved toward Vasquez. Emily's hand tightened on the doorframe. She was doing the calculation. Vasquez versus 1, manageable. Vasquez versus 2, while Hargreaves went for Bay 7, not manageable. The numbers were wrong, and she knew it, and she opened the door. Hargreaves. He looked at her. In the flat emergency light, his face was composed in a way that was almost academic. The expression of a man who had been preparing for this specific confrontation for long enough that all the fear had burned off and left something harder and colder behind. The documentation is already transmitted, she said. 3 independent servers, MCID has it. 2 external military law offices have it. You can't pull it back. She kept her voice level. Whatever you came here to do, it doesn't change what already happened. What I came here to do, he said, is not about the documentation. That stopped her, because he was right, and she'd known it the moment she'd seen him in the corridor, and she'd been trying to not finish the thought. The documentation was secured. He knew it was secured. Steck had known, on that call 42 minutes ago, that the operation was compromised and the records were likely already beyond reach. He hadn't sent Hargreaves to destroy evidence. He'd sent him because there was one thing that documents couldn't replicate, one thing that made a case like this bulletproof in front of a review board and a court-martial, not paper evidence, which could be challenged, disputed, attributed to forgery by expensive lawyers, but a living witness who had been present at the operation, who had made the original entry, who could sit in front of an investigative panel and describe exactly what she had seen. Her. You understand, Hargreaves said, simply. Yes, she said. The figure that had been moving toward Vasquez had stopped. The other one was still, watching Emily. Hargreaves himself took 1 step forward, and she stayed in the doorway, and she was aware in a very precise way of the distance between them, and what she had available and what she didn't. She'd been a combat medic. That was the designation, the official record, the thing that got written in files. What the file didn't capture, what files never quite managed, was what 6 years embedded with special operations units actually produced in a person. The things you learned by proximity and necessity, and the particular education of surviving situations that went wrong in ways that required more than medical intervention. She was not going to enumerate those things in the corridor of Blackstone Medical Center. She was 31 years old, and she had a chest tube patient 10 feet behind her. And she was tired, properly tired. in the way that went past the body into something older. But she was also not moving. "There are federal agents on this floor," she said. "There are MCID personnel. And you came up a back stairwell in the dark with 2 people and no credentials that will hold up to scrutiny. You've already lost." She looked at him steadily. "The only question is what the next 60 seconds costs you." "Emily," Rourke's voice from behind her. Quiet. She didn't look back. Hargreaves took another step. She tracked the 2 flanking figures in her peripheral vision. One had shifted slightly left, which was the tell of someone about to move, and she was already adjusting her weight when the north stairwell door opened again. Harold came through first. 63, 20 years as a hospital security guard, bad left knee that he complained about every winter. He was not impressive in any cinematic sense. He had a radio and a flashlight and a colleague behind him who was younger and considerably larger, and they came through that door with the unhurried authority of people who knew every inch of this building and understood, better than anyone with tactical training, that knowing the ground was its own advantage. Dark came through the south stairwell door at the same moment. She took in the corridor configuration in one sweep, and she didn't hesitate. "Hargreaves. Federal warrant. Do not move." The 2 flanking figures made the calculation that people made when the math stopped working in their favor. One of them actually moved toward the exit, which Dark's colleague anticipated and blocked. The other went still, the stillness of someone who has decided that whatever they were being paid for this, it wasn't enough. Hargreaves didn't move. He stood in the corridor and looked at Emily Carter, and his face did something complicated that she didn't have a name for. Not defeat exactly, not the operatic collapse of someone confronted with justice in a movie. It was smaller than that, quieter. The expression of a man who had been running a particular version of events for 3 years and was now standing at the point where that version ended. "The original form," he said, not loud, almost to himself. "I changed 4 words in a documentation entry, and you logged them back." "I log what I see," she said. "I always log what I see." He nodded once, like it was almost something he could respect. In another context, in another life. Then Dark was at his shoulder, and the handcuffs came out, and it wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't clean. His jacket caught on the cuff mechanism, and someone had to readjust, and Harold was asking the flanking figure to please put his hands where Harold could see them, in the pleasant, firm voice of a man who had handled situations considerably messier than this. And the corridor of Blackstone Medical Center's trauma floor at 5:17 in the morning looked exactly like what it was, which was unglamorous and exhausting and real. Emily went back into Bay 7 and sat down in the hard plastic chair. Rourke was still on the bed, legs over the side, chest tube intact. He'd done what she'd asked. She checked the monitors, still running on backup, the readings sluggish but present. His pressure was down 2 points from the last reading, but not alarmingly. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. She let herself sit in that for exactly 30 seconds. Then she got up and reattached the pulse oximeter and logged the vitals and checked the drainage bag, because the work didn't stop, because the crisis did. The work was always there, and right now the work was the thing that kept her in her body and out of the place in her head where she'd have to start processing what had just happened. That place could wait. Tran appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later with a cut above his left eyebrow that someone had butterfly taped with the particular efficiency of a person who'd done field first aid on themselves before. "Generators back." The overhead lights returned in a flood of fluorescent white that made everyone blink. The monitors beeped back to full resolution. The ventilator alarm down the hall, which had been screaming on battery backup for the better part of half an hour, went quiet. Somewhere on the floor, someone let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for a long time. Emily looked at Rourke in the proper light for the first time in 40 minutes. He looked like a man who had been shot, which was accurate. He also looked like a man who was going to be all right, which she allowed herself to note. "Lab panel," she said. "I'm ordering it now." "You already ordered it an hour ago," he said. "Then I'm following up on it." She picked up the chart. "Because that's what I do." Cham. The next 6 hours were medicine. Just medicine, stripped of everything else. Labs drawn, results reviewed, chest tube output monitored at 15-minute intervals, fluid balance recalculated twice. Dark's people moved through the hospital with the systematic thoroughness of a federal operation in full deployment, interviewing staff, collecting security footage, processing the physical evidence from the corridor and the generator room and the stairwell. Steck was taken from the building at 6:40 a.m. in the particular unceremony of someone whose authority has been specifically, formally, and irreversibly removed. He walked out under his own power, suit still intact, and did not look up as he passed the nurse's station. Hargreaves was processed separately, taken out the service entrance. His two associates, private contractors, Dark told Emily later, with a flatness that suggested the use of private contractors was its own additional charge, were held for questioning. Hale caught Emily in the medication room at 7:15. She was reconciling a narcotic count, which was something that got done regardless of the night's events because the count always got done. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She kept counting. "The patient in Bay 11, he said finally. "You were right. The surgical consult found early compartment syndrome. They operated at 4 a.m. She's going to have full function." She noted the count on the sheet. "Good." Another pause. He was doing the thing that people did when they wanted to say something and hadn't figured out the right shape for it yet. She'd watched him do it before, usually when a junior resident had made a catch he'd missed, the internal negotiation between ego and accuracy. "The concerns you flagged about Rourke's wound," he said. "The trajectory, the positioning." He stopped. "You knew before any of the rest of us." "I had context nobody else had." "Still." He looked at the medication room wall. "I dismissed it." She put the pen down. She looked at him directly, which she had a feeling he found uncomfortable, and which she was not going to stop doing. "Yes, you did. I'm sorry for that." She thought about what to say to that. She thought about the 2 corrections in front of patients, the overreaching comment, the 14 months of being read as less than she was by someone who'd decided what she was before he'd looked carefully. She thought about the fact that he had also, at 4:17 in the morning, ordered the surgical consult that saved a woman's leg function. People were not single data points. She knew that better than most. "It won't happen again," she said. Not a question. He met her eyes. "No, it won't." She picked up the pen and finished the count. Rourke was stable enough for careful transfer to a military medical facility at 2 in the afternoon. Emily did the handoff herself. Thorough, documented, walked the incoming medical team through every entry in the chart with the particular attention of someone who understood what incomplete handoffs cost. The receiving physician was competent and listened, which was the baseline she required. Rourke was in the transfer gurney, IV relocated, chest tube secured for transport. He looked better than he had any right to look given the previous 12 hours. She stood at the gurney, and they looked at each other, and there was a conversation that happened in that look that neither of them was going to put into words right now, possibly ever, because some of it didn't have words, and some of it would take years to say properly. "Pemberton," he said. "He should know how this ended. I'll call him. Tell him—" He stopped. "Tell him the record is straight." She nodded. He reached out and shook her hand, which was the kind of gesture that men with his particular history used when they meant something more than a handshake but didn't have another available vocabulary for it. She shook it back. "Take care of yourself," she said. He almost said the obvious thing, "You too," and then didn't because they both knew it was more complicated than that, and platitudes were something neither of them had patience for. He said, "You're good at this, both things. And not everyone can say that." She let go of his hand and stepped back, and the gurney moved. She watched the elevator doors close. She called Pemberton from the parking lot at 3 in the afternoon, sitting on the hood of her 6-year-old Civic in the October sun, which was thin and cold and felt like the realest thing she'd touched in about 36 hours. He answered on the first ring. "The record is straight," she said. "Rourke wanted you to know." A silence on his end that was not empty. She could hear him working through whatever he'd been carrying for 2 years and 3 months, the same weight she'd been carrying, just from a different angle. "Hargreaves," he said. "In custody, Steck, the 2 contractors. Dark says Calloway's office is under formal investigation, the IG is involved, and it's moving up the chain." She looked at the parking lot, the familiar nothing of a Tuesday afternoon in Redwood Falls. "It's going to take time." The legal process, I know how long it takes, but it's moving. Another silence, then quietly, I should have gone further back then, when I had the chance. You kept the thread alive for 3 years, she said. Without that thread, none of tonight happens. Don't do that to yourself. He didn't respond to that immediately, which meant he was going to do it to himself regardless, because that was the kind of person Pemberton was. He'd carry the could-haves the same way she'd carried the documentation, in the locked place for a long time. She understood it. She wasn't going to argue him out of it in a parking lot phone call. The families, he said. The Ardent team. Darkus said that's first, before anything else in the legal process. Good. His voice had gone rougher. Yeah, good. She sat on the hood of the Civic and let the silence be what it needed to be for a moment. Are you okay? He said. She thought about it honestly, the way she'd been trying to be honest with herself for the past year without quite managing it. I don't know yet, she said. Ask me in a week. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Fair enough. Dale? She looked at the thin October sky. Thank you. For keeping my name, for giving it to Rourke. She paused. I know what it costs to stay connected to any of this. You'd have done the same. She would have. They both knew it. That was the thing about the people you served with. You didn't have to explain the baseline because it was shared, built from the same material, tested in the same conditions. She hadn't had that in 14 months, and she felt the absence of it now that it had briefly, imperfectly returned. Take care, she said. You too, Em. She sat on the hood until the cold worked through her scrubs. Then she got in the car and drove home to the apartment on Delancey Street. 3 months was not a long time for a case of this complexity, but certain things moved faster than others. The formal military investigation into Task Force Ardent's mission record opened within 2 weeks of the night at Blackstone. The amended after-action report was officially designated as falsified evidence. The families of the 6 soldiers who had died in the operation were contacted in person, not by form letter, not by a junior administrative officer, but by Dark and a 2-person team from the Inspector General's office who sat in living rooms and kitchen tables and said the words that families had been owed for 2 years. The official record was wrong, and this is what actually happened, and your person was not responsible for what went wrong, and we are sorry that it took this long. Emily knew this because Dark told her in a phone call in early January, with the directness that had characterized everything Dark said to her. She didn't know the details of those conversations. She wasn't there, but she knew they'd happened, and she held that, and it was one of the few things in the whole architecture of the previous months that felt entirely clean. Steck was formally charged in December, Hargreaves 2 weeks later. The private contractors entered plea agreements that implicated 3 additional individuals in the network, 2 in logistics positions, 1 in the communications infrastructure that had enabled the coordination during the original Ardent operation. Calloway resigned from his position in November, citing health reasons, which was the kind of language that everyone understood and no one was required to acknowledge directly. His formal investigation continued. None of it was fast. None of it was neat. The legal proceedings moved through military and federal systems at the pace those systems moved, which was its own kind of frustration. Watching a case this significant get processed with the same bureaucratic deliberateness as any other case, because the system didn't accelerate for significance. It accelerated for pressure, and the pressure was being applied carefully and steadily from multiple directions. Emily kept working. That was not a noble choice or a dramatic one. It was just what made sense. She was a nurse. She was good at it. She went to Blackstone on her shifts, and she did her rounds, and she flagged the things that needed flagging, and she did not look for validation in any of it. The validation came anyway, in the awkward, unpolished way that real things tended to arrive. Hale started consulting her on cases, not formally. Nothing was ever said, no protocol was established. He just started appearing beside her when she was charting and asking her read on things, and she gave her read, and twice she was right about something he'd missed, and he ordered the relevant tests without making it a thing, which was the most they were ever going to manage and was probably enough. Paula, the charge nurse, stopped scheduling Emily exclusively for the least desirable shifts, also without comment. The hospital received a formal commendation from the MCID in mid-November for cooperation with a federal investigation. The letter was addressed to the nursing staff by name, Emily Carter listed first. It was posted on the break room bulletin board by someone who wasn't Emily, and it stayed there. Small things. Imperfect acknowledgments. She'd spent 14 months being invisible, and she wasn't going to pretend that a bulletin board posting made that history irrelevant. But she also wasn't going to pretend it meant nothing. In February, she received a letter. Military letterhead. Formal language. The kind that had been written by someone in an administrative role who was very good at the official register and probably less comfortable with the human register. But under the official language, the content was this. In recognition of her service as an Army combat medic, in recognition of her role in preserving evidence critical to a federal investigation, and in recognition of her continued dedication to patient care under conditions that were, to use the letter's word, exceptional, she was being offered a formal reinstatement of her military record. The medical discharge notation that had followed her transfer out of service, the vague, uncomplimentary designation that had said nothing specific and implied something damaging, was being removed and replaced with an honorable separation at her request. She read the letter twice. She set it on the kitchen table next to the tea she hadn't drunk. She thought about the 6 people who weren't going to get a letter. She was not going to perform uncomplicated happiness about this. That wasn't who she was, and it wouldn't be honest. There was grief in it that ran alongside the relief. Grief for what had been done to her team, for the years she'd spent trying to be small enough to be safe, for the things that were being made right now but couldn't be made unwrong. Both things were real. She was done pretending they weren't. She accepted the record restoration. A week later, she received a second communication, this one a phone call, dark again, with a different kind of offer. A position. A joint task force being assembled under the MCID mandate to investigate exactly the kind of internal misconduct that the Ardent case had exposed. They needed someone with field medical experience, with operational knowledge, and with the particular kind of judgment that came from having been on both sides of the institutional trust equation. It's not a desk job, Dark said. Good, Emily said. It's not glamorous. The work is slow. You'd be dealing with bureaucratic resistance on a near-daily basis, and the wins are incremental. I've been a night shift nurse for 14 months, Emily said. Describe the pay. Dark described the pay, which was an improvement. She also described the reporting structure and the travel requirements and the specific nature of the case backlog. And Emily listened and asked 3 questions that were all practical and none of them sentimental, because that was how she made decisions about things that mattered. She said she'd think about it. She stood at the window of the apartment on Delancey Street and looked at the broken blinds that she'd never fixed, and the street below and the winter gray sky over Redwood Falls, which was not an ugly sky when you looked at it without expectation. She thought about what she'd built here, the careful nothing, the way she'd kept herself at a distance from her own life for over a year because staying distant felt like staying safe. She thought about Bay 7 and the emergency lighting and Hargreaves in the corridor, and she thought about the woman in Bay 11 who had full use of her leg because someone had paid attention at the right moment. She thought about what it cost to pay attention, what it cost to be the person who logged what they saw every time, even when what they saw was inconvenient, even when nobody was going to believe them, even when the form went into an archive and the archive got closed and 3 years went by and it still mattered. It always mattered. That was the thing she'd learned or relearned or confirmed, that documentation mattered, that precision mattered, that the boring disciplined work of writing down exactly what you saw and refusing to change it under pressure was not a small thing. It was maybe the most important thing. The 6 people who died in Task Force Ardent. Ardent's last operation had deserved someone to document the truth of what happened to them, and she had. And it had taken 3 years and 1 terrible night at a regional hospital in upstate New York to make that documentation count. She called Dark back. Yes, she said. Well, she gave 4 weeks' notice at Blackstone. She told Paula first, which felt right. Paula said she wasn't surprised and then immediately looked like she'd intended to say something warmer than that. And Emily told her that not being surprised was probably the best professional compliment she'd received in 14 months. And Paula laughed, actually laughed, and it was a little awkward and real. Hale stopped her in the corridor on her second-to-last shift. He had a chart in his hand, which was his version of having something to hold on to. "Where are you going?" he said. "Federal casework, MCID." He processed that for a moment. "Medical?" "Field medical consultation. Case investigation. Both." He nodded slowly. He looked like a man who was revising a prior assessment, which she'd watched him do before, and which she had come to understand, actually capable of. The revision just cost him something each time. "You were right about the wound presentation," he said. "That first night, the trajectory." "I know." "I should have—" "Yes," she said, simply. Not cruelly, just exactly. "But you also ordered the consult at 4 a.m. when it was needed, so—" She shrugged. "People are complicated." He extended his hand. She shook it. On her last shift, she did her rounds the same way she always did. Methodical, present, starting from bay 1 and working through to the end of the floor. She checked the things that needed checking. She flagged the things that needed flagging. She wrote the notes that needed to be written clearly in language that the next nurse would understand without interpretation. She left a detailed transition note on every patient she was handing off. 4 pages, single-spaced. Paula told her it was more thorough than any transition documentation the floor had ever received, and Emily said she hoped so, because it was the last one she was writing here and she wanted it done right. She clocked out at 11 p.m. She was in the parking lot, keys in hand, when she heard someone behind her. Rourke was standing at the edge of the lot. He was in civilian clothes, jeans, a jacket that was probably warmer than it looked, and he was moving carefully, the careful, deliberate movement of a man 4 months out from a hemopneumothorax who had pushed his physical recovery as hard as the physical recovery would allow. She hadn't known he was coming. She looked at him for a moment in the parking lot light. "You could have called," she said. "I could have." He walked toward her until they were standing at a conversational distance in the cold February night. "Vasquez told me you were done here. Tonight. News travels. Small community." He looked at the hospital building, then back at her. Steck's preliminary hearing was last week," Hargreaves pleaded. "The plea deal implicated 2 more people in Calloway's office, which the IG is apparently very happy about." He paused. "The Ardent families were officially notified in December. All of them." "I know. I went to see 2 of them." His voice shifted register, still controlled, but with something underneath that wasn't. "Just to... I don't know. I didn't know what to say. I still don't." "What did you say?" "I told them what I knew, the actual sequence, what the real record shows." He looked at the ground briefly. "One of the mothers, her son was 24, she asked me why it took 3 years, and I didn't have a good answer." Emily looked at him. "Because the people responsible for telling the truth decided not to. That's the answer. It's not a good one." "No." He met her eyes. She said at least it came out. She said she'd been told enough versions of what happened that she'd stopped being able to hold any of them. And now she could hold one. And it was true. He paused. "I think that's why I came here tonight, because I wanted you to know that, what it meant for her, that you kept the document." Emily looked at him, and she thought about a lot of things, and she didn't say any of them right away because some of them weren't ready to be said. "Pemberton would have done the same thing," she said. "Pemberton wasn't there. You were." She nodded. She accepted that, which was harder than it should have been and also easier than it would have been 14 months ago. She was working on the part of herself that deflected credit as a protective mechanism. It was slow work. "You're taking the MCID position," Rourke said. Not a question. "Yes." "Good." He said it with the straightforward conviction of someone who has thought about the right outcome and arrived at it cleanly. "You shouldn't be hiding." "I wasn't hiding," she said. "I was waiting." He looked at her. She held the look. "For what?" he said. She thought about it honestly. For something that couldn't be undone to be witnessed, for the record to be more than a document in a hidden drive, for the moment when the thing she'd carried alone for 2 years and 3 months became something that other people could see and verify and confirm as real. She'd spent 14 months telling herself she'd left the military and moved to Redwood Falls and built a quiet life, and the truth was simpler and harder than that. She'd been waiting to find out if the truth was strong enough to survive being told. It was. "I wasn't sure the document would be enough," she said. "Now I know it was." He nodded. He extended his hand and she shook it, same as the first time, and like the first time it carried more than a handshake was equipped to carry, and like the first time neither of them had a better vocabulary for it. "Take care of yourself," she said. The same thing she'd said at the gurney, which was the kind of phrase she'd always considered insufficient and was starting to reconsider. Sometimes insufficient was what was available. Sometimes what was available was enough. "You saved my life," he said. She looked at him in the cold February parking lot of Blackstone Medical Center in Redwood Falls, and she thought about what had actually happened in that building. The chest tube and the accountability form and the emergency lighting and Harold and his flashlight and Dark in the corridor and a chain of events that had taken 3 years and dozens of people in one small, carefully preserved document to reach this point. "No," she said. "We saved the truth. Your life came with it." He smiled, properly, actually smiled, which she hadn't seen from him before, and which made him look briefly like a different and possibly less complicated person. She drove home to Delancey Street and she sat on the second-hand couch, and she looked at the broken blinds and she thought that she'd never fix them because she'd never been sure she was staying. She was staying now, or she was leaving. She was taking the MCID position, and she'd have to find an apartment in another city, and her life was going to change in ways she couldn't fully map yet. But she was done being provisional, done treating her own existence as a condition to be managed rather than a life to be lived. That was what the night at Blackstone had done. Finally, for her. Not saved her, she hadn't needed saving. It had confirmed that staying in the truth, staying precise and present, and stubbornly accurate about what she saw was not a liability. It was the only way she knew how to be. She'd been trying to make it smaller than that for too long. She got up and fixed the blinds. It took 11 minutes and a flathead screwdriver, and the repair was imperfect. The slats didn't quite align on the left side. But they worked, and the room looked different with the light coming through them. And she stood there for a moment in the changed light of her apartment and let it be what it was. There's a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't perform, and it doesn't ask for permission, and it doesn't wait for the room to notice it. It just shows up, shift after shift, entry after entry, doing the work that needs doing, and logging what it sees and refusing to change the record because someone in authority finds the record inconvenient. Most people walk past that kind of strength every day without seeing it. It's in the nurse who flags the chart entry nobody else caught, the technician who notices the equipment hasn't been calibrated, the person who makes a copy of the form because they've learned that the form matters, even when, especially when, it seems like it won't. The world runs on those people. It is kept honest by them, in the small, persistent ways that honesty requires to survive. Emily Carter had always known what she was. She'd spent 14 months in Redwood Falls trying to be less of it. She was done being less.